What's good, YouTube? It's your boy Drowsy. Today we got none other than why graves are actually dug 6 feet deep. This is a new series on the channel. We're gonna stop reacting to the Infographics show. But if this gets pulled, then no, we will not. But yeah, without further ado, let's do it.
In the dead of night, sometime in the late 1700s, two masked Englishmen sneak into a graveyard. As a thick cloud moves in front of an almost full moon, they hop from headstone to headstone on their way to the prize. Miss Crinklebottom has just passed away from a bad case of consumption. God bless her soul. And her newly interred body is ready for the taking. These couple of so-called body snatchers are well aware that the corpse of dear Mrs. Crinklebottom is worth a good bit of money if sold to the right people. So with empty stomachs, they have no qualms about resurrecting her. Getting her out isn't hard either. In no time at all, the two men are chuckling as they carry the cadaver through the dark streets of London. After hearing that, we're guessing you already have a good idea as to why graves might have been dug 6 feet in depth. Grave robbing was a job back in those days for some people.
So I'm gonna make a guess, right? Graves are dug 6 feet deep because if you dig them any shallower, you could smell the rotten flesh decaying from the body. I guess that is why. Well, that's why I think they dig them 6 feet deep now. I could be wrong. Because animals, I think you have to bury them 4 feet deep, like dogs and stuff like that. But from past animals that have died or whatever in the family, we always dig the hole a little bit deeper.
Require much skill and could earn a person a good living. So now you might ask, why rob a grave? Surely there isn't a huge market for smelly corpses? Well, there was back then. Gravediggers, sometimes called resurrectionists or resurrection men, were actually doing the work that the government kind of wanted done. You see, the medical profession was advancing very fast, but there weren't enough fresh bodies around for a growing number of anatomists in medical schools. That's one of the reasons why the government only made stealing a corpse a misdemeanor crime. The medical men of the time would usually get their bodies from people who had been sentenced to death and also dissection. But the thing was, this kind of sentence was reserved for only the very worst crimes. There just weren't enough extreme crimes being committed, so the anatomists were always short of bodies. That's why they paid for them on the black market, and why the government turned a blind eye to the trade. Of course, Mrs. Crinklebottom's devoted husband and family wouldn't have been too happy about their beloved going missing in the night. Back then, in all parts of Britain, families were aware that their loved one might be stolen. That's why they'd sometimes guard over the grave for days or pile big stones on it, or even surround it with iron bars. Still, those wily grave diggers were hard to stop. Even if the grave was covered, they'd sometimes dig a hole close to it and then tunnel to the coffin. They'd then open the box and pull out the body, taking it back through the tunnel. They could subsequently cover up the hole, and the relatives of the deceased wouldn't know anything had happened. A day or two later, a bunch of bespectacled men and with white beards would be brandishing scalpels as they stood over an almost fresh corpse. It was really big business. You might have heard of two Brits named Burke and Hare. They hatched a plan one day while sitting in a tavern over a few ales. Why wait for people to die, they thought. Why not just kill someone and then tell the guys at the medical school that they dug the body up? And that's exactly what they did, and the surgeons paid them hard cash for their victims. It happened in the US too. Sometimes criminally minded women would turn up at the poorhouses and shed rivers of tears for their newly dead. It was all an act, they just wanted the body to sell on. The US was a bit behind Europe when it came to anatomical dissection, but it was catching up, so it too had a body shortage problem. So corpses were snatched just like they were over the pond. It was illegal, of course, but some people thought, well, it's for the greater good. When a famous physician named Charles Knowlton was arrested for performing a dissection on a body that he had no bruises cutting up, he defended his actions by saying the work he was doing could increase the happiness or diminish the misery of mankind. He was probably right, but the public didn't really see eye to eye with the man. Remember, there were a lot of people who really didn't want their loved ones ending up on the chopping block, never mind how good it might be for their future brethren. Laws were eventually changed so that people could donate their bodies to science, but before that happened, grave robbing was so serious that sometimes cemeteries had to be guarded day and night. That's one reason why the grave robbers sometimes turned to places called a potter's field, which is where the poor and unclaimed were laid to rest, usually in unmarked graves. Even they might be guarded, but the guys stealing for the physicians could easily get around that with a small bribe. There was also the fact that some bodies were seen as fair game just because they had died poor and were seen as having a low social standing. African American bodies were sometimes stolen over poor white bodies. which in 1787 led a group of free blacks to petition the local council in New York State.
Hey, this
They
guy,
wrote,
he's black.
under the cover of night,
What?
they dig up the bodies of the deceased.
I
Friends
guess
and relatives of
racism
the
was
petitioners
present back
carry
then.
them away without respect to age or sex, mangle their flesh
Racism
out
still
of wanton
present
curiosity,
today.
and then
Bigotry, all
expose
that.
it to beasts and birds. Slaves in the South were often dissected after death, as were criminals of any color who'd been sentenced to death. In all, grave robbing was a huge problem all over the U.S. It was reported that yearly as many as 40,000 bodies were stolen for the purpose of advancing medical science, and people weren't happy about it.
Fuck.
Sure, you could pay a fair bit of cash and buy what one company called burglar-proof grave vaults made of steel, but not everyone was wealthy enough to do that. One simple and cheap solution was to bury the body farther down. That's just one of the theories as to why bodies were buried deep, although there are more theories. We just thought you needed to hear a little bit of the history of grave robbing. 6 feet is a lot of digging, so generally people wouldn't have to put in the effort when, say, 3 or 4 feet would have done the job. That was the case in 17th century in England. But then in 1665, something awful besieged the city of
Goddamn ads, man.
London. This was called the Great Plague of London. The city might have been bustling and one of the centers of the world, but it was also overcrowded and filthy in parts. This London plague killed around 100,000 people, which worked out at about a quarter of the entire population. That's why the authorities came up with a bunch of ways to try and prevent the spread of the plague. Believe it or not, they imposed a lockdown, but only on houses where they thought people were sick with the deadly disease. When we say lockdown, it was more like being locked in. If people were suspected of carrying the plague, their house was basically locked up from the outside on the order of the Justices of the Peace in Middlesex. Many of the public, mostly the poor public, didn't much like this, and they rioted in the streets and opened up locked down houses. This is what a well-known minister said in regard to how the public felt at the time. Fear quickly begins to creep upon people's hearts. Great thoughts and discourse there is in town about the plague. The rich of London got out of there, but most people were stuck, and as we said, many of them died. So one of the things those people came up with to prevent the spread was to make sure the dead bodies were well and truly buried. A pamphlet was passed around at the time with the title, "Orders Conceived and Published by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of the City of London Concerning the Infection of the Plague."
Oh, okay, so it was
There
because
were
of the
quite a
Black
lot of
Plague,
orders
or the
indeed.
plague.
One of them was that watchmen were to stand outside the houses of the infected day and night to ensure no one went inside. Searchers were hired to seek out infected persons, and they were followed by chirurgeons, and that's an old word for surgeon. Social distancing measures were also put into place with dinners at taverns and alehouses to be stopped. There were a lot more orders, but for the purpose of today's show, we'll go straight to the part headed Burial of the Dead. Basically, people were
we're an
ordered not to
educational
go
channel.
anywhere near the corpse or even the grave of someone who died from the plague. But the order also said this: all the graves shall be at least 6 foot deep. So possibly it was disease and that very order where the 6-foot thing originated. Still, it wasn't exactly a strict science. Often the victims of the plague were thrown into deep pits with lots of other people. Word on the street is that another reason why 6 foot was the measurement of choice was because if the grave was any more shallow, the body might accidentally be relieved of its resting place by a rather powerful plow. On top of that, with a shallow grave, there was a chance of an animal getting to the corpse. But that still doesn't really explain 6 feet. Why not 5.2 feet? Surely even a Jack Russell Terrier in its prime couldn't get down that low. Let's imagine that people did in fact want to bury the bodies quite deep because of disease or plows or even animals with strong claws. The question then might be, just how low can you go? Some people have suggested that back in the day, someone came up with the idea of 6 feet was about as deep as you could dig without the digging becoming dangerous. They said any deeper than that and the walls might cave in. On top of this, what about that poor grave digger in the days before machines did the digging? Not only would his job have been very dangerous as he dug down, say 7 feet, but if he pushed it to 10 feet, he would have been asking for trouble. For that reason, graves were dug to a similar depth as a person's height. That way, he was likely not in danger and the hole was deep enough to prevent things from happening that we've discussed. He could likely even get out of the hole without use of a ladder.
Okay.
Then there was the rule of thumb, which, as you know, means making a rough estimate without any kind of precision involved. It's kind of doing what seems right. In the case of graves, the rule of thumb might have been to bury a person down according to their height. Maybe a safe grave was as deep as it was long. In the case of a man's average height back in the 17th and 18th centuries, it was something like
a 7-foot dude.
165 centimeters, in England at least. A 6-foot-ish grave might have made sense if you believe the rule of thumb theory. The saying is an old one, and it was likely used in the past, but these days gravediggers anywhere in the world are not told to dig a grave exactly 6 feet. In the US, there is no rule about 6 feet. with a grave being dug only as deep as the local authority says it should be. That depth will often be 30 to 36 inches above the coffin, which would work out at closer to 4 feet or just a bit over in total. It's the same in the UK, with most graves being dug so there's 3 feet of space above the coffin once it's down there. Coffins, of course, are not all the same size. For some particularly obese people, a coffin can be supersized. That might also require a deeper grave. It also depends on how people are buried. For instance, in Pennsylvania, if there's a concrete vault, it's written that the distance from parts of the top of the outer case containing the casket may not be less than 1.5 feet from the natural surface of the ground. In New York, if there's a concrete vault, it should be at least 2 feet from the surface, and if there is no vault, then the distance should be 3 feet from the surface. We actually found an academic paper titled Burial Practices in Southern Appalachia, which told us things like back in the day when someone was buried in those parts, the family would often throw into the grave jewelry, eyeglasses, tobacco pipes, guns, knives, toys, Bibles, and alcoholic beverages. The paper also said that those graves should be 6 feet deep, which was to prevent burrowing animals from getting close to the coffin. That was in the past, though. These days, the folks from Appalachia don't likely go 6 feet under. Then you have the fact that sometimes coffins are stacked on top of each other, so in some cases, the grave will be way deeper than 6 feet. All in all, it's unlikely when you pass you'll be resting deep down in the ground, but will be closer to pushing up daisies. Now you need to watch Best Evidence of Life After Death, or have a look at this.
Alright, that was a little bit different. That's infographics. If they don't pull this video, like I said, I'll react to more infographics. Yeah, we're an educational channel. I learned something. Hope you learned something. I'll be your boy Drowsy. It is 4 a.m. in the morning, but I got like 6 more videos to do, and I'm out.